the questions are pretty general, and I mean, you know what the award's about, so it's about Tahrir and your participation in the military trials, and I'm sure you've talked about that like 100 times by now. But if you can tell us a bit about your participation in Tahrir in January and February of 2011.
Okay. So shall I start?
Just go for it.
Okay, so do I have to look at the camera or towards you?
Look at me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I participated in Tahrir just like any other girl, any other citizen really. I went out on January 25th, and I thought I would be a protester, but I thought I would also help with covering what's happening. So basically I used my phone and Twitter to give updates and to encourage my friends and people that I know to join me. And also I usually, whenever, like in the past couple of years, it's always been something that I would do with whenever we have a major political event or protest, that I would always follow up with Hisham Mubarak Law Center and the other human rights organization centers, following with detainees and sorting out lists of names of detainees and getting through to their families and sorting out like food and lawyers and any legal aid they need. So this is something I always used. I used to do in the past couple of years. So in the first couple of days, this is what I helped with. And then January 28th came, and there was a major internet blackout. So me, along with other friends, found an internet spot, and it became our sort of main responsibility or main concern to try as much as possible to collect footage and information about what's happening in Egypt, and get it out to the outside world so people would know. So at least there will be witnesses to what's happening here. And then the Tahrir community was established, and I stayed there, just helping with whatever I can help with. So helping with organizational stuff, with sending out calls for what needs to be done, what needs to be brought for the Tahrir, food, medical supplies, wounded that need to be followed. Whenever there were attacks on Tahrir Square, we would help cover them to local international media and so on. So I think it was just really a regular role. You're just there, and like everyone else, your age or older or younger, and you really try to participate in whatever you can help with. And then February happened, February 25th. We were sitting in front of the Parliament building, and it was the first time. Till that point, people really believed that the army was either protecting the revolution or at least playing a neutral role and not really acting against the revolution. And February 25th was the first time the army brutally and publicly put an end to a protest or a sit-in, and they violently dispersed the sit-in that was in Tahrir and the extension of the sit-in, which is the one I was participating in front of the Parliament building. And it was like total chaos. So they used electric probes, they beat up everyone, they arrested many people, they beat them up, and then they would release them or they would still detain them. And that was sort of the turning point in my life. That was the beginning of the journey of No Military Trials. I was leaving with my family. I had my mother and my brother and his wife with me, and because they saw we had an older woman and they recognized my mother as an old opposition figure, an older officer gave an order for us not to be harmed. As we were leaving, we saw them dragging in a young man and beating him up behind the checkpoints of the army. So my mother insisted we were not going to leave without him. And we were joined by others. One of them was his cousin. A couple of minutes later, he was released to us and he was beaten up. And we found out that his name is Amr al-Bahiri. We walked a bit away, we talked to him, we checked he's fine, we got his contact with his cousin, and we took a photograph of his injury so we could get in touch with him later for filing a report against what he had just experienced. And then we left him and his cousin and 4 other people with us in 2 cars to leave, and we were walking away and with the family. And then we got a phone call 10 minutes later that they were rearrested at the other end of the road. And they are talking of charging them with possession of armed weapon. Of course, this is ridiculous. Yani. They didn't have any of this with them. And I kept on following over the next 2 days. And what happened is that everyone else we know was released. They all said the same thing. Amr in particular was beaten up and was tortured more than the others. And they tried to frame him, they tried to frame one of them with possession of a weapon, and they couldn't. So, because one of them was a university professor, and eventually they said it's going to be Amr al-Bahiri who's going to be charged with this. For 2 days I followed with his family and his lawyer. We tried to find out what's going to happen to him. We contacted everyone who's in touch with the army and the Supreme Council of Armed Forces to tell them that this is a peaceful protester and this is one of the youth revolutionaries, and he was peaceful and there's some sort of mistake. And we really believe this is going to be sorted out within a couple of days. 2 days later, we found out that he was tried in a military trial. His lawyers were given false information. They were told he's going to be tried in another 2 weeks. His family were not told also the truth, and he was tried. The charges have changed because we wrote our testimonies and we sent it to the general prosecutor, and our testimony stated very clearly that he couldn't have possessed weapons because he was with the army and they released him to us. If he had weapons, they wouldn't have released him in the first place before re-arresting him again. So they changed the charges, and he was charged with assaulting an officer and breaking curfew, and he was sentenced 5 years. And he was sent to an extremely far away prison, which is like 9 hours road trip from Cairo. This was the beginning. I started following with the lawyer, and the first time the lawyer went to the military court, he called me and he said, Amr's not on his own. I have met many families here who have been going through this and we don't even know about it. And the lawyer's name is Adel Ramadan. He works with the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. So we decided to draft a call and send it out on Facebook and Twitter, basically putting our phone numbers and saying, if you are facing military trials, or if you know someone who has been sentenced and is spending time in prison now because of military trials, please get in touch with us and we would provide volunteering, like legal work. And we started following the cases. Then March 9th happened, which was the biggest crackdown on Tahrir Square by the army with the aid of plainclothes civilians. And it was really the complete evacuation of Tahrir. Like, Tahrir was completely evacuated from all protesters and tents and everything. And more than 150 activists were detained. This is the incident from which all the very famous testimonies of torture in the Egyptian Museum, or girls that had to go through virginity checks in the military prison came. So a lot of friends and colleagues and activists recognized that this means military trials are going to be a very essential tool for the Supreme Council of Armed Forces to counter the revolution. And so we sent out the call for anyone who's willing to work on this. And mid-March, I think, we announced the campaign, officially the campaign No Military Trials for Civilians to be formed. And we basically thought we had 2 things to do. The first thing is provide legal aid for all those who cannot afford to pay for lawyers. And the second thing, since media didn't want to tackle the issue whether of military trials of civilians or torture and abuses committed by army personnel towards civilians. So we thought we are going to do our own media, document the stories of those people, give them a chance to tell the stories that they were not allowed to tell in court, and eventually force all people participating in the political, I don't know, political scene and traditional media to talk about this.
Okay. Keep going. What kind of challenges do you face in your work as a human rights defender?
Okay. At the beginning, when we started working, what was really tough is that there was this notion among the majority of people that the army are backing the revolution. And so nobody really wanted to acknowledge or accept that that they are torturing civilians and that they are targeting revolutionaries. It was very hard creating any event or protest or anything to expose whether torture testimonies or talk about people who are facing unfair trials. Especially that at the beginning people actually regarded military trials as sort of a victory for the revolution, because they were always put in a way that made it seem as if they are actually protecting us from the remnants of the old regime. So it would be military trials of 20 thugs who tried to attack a neighborhood, or military trials of 20 criminals who tried to attack a protest. But when you dig deep into it, you realize that we had protests happening in every major square in the country, and we had people chanting the army and the people on one hand, and at the backstage of all these protests that were happening were just people who were massively arrested, sentenced in a matter of couple of minutes, with no lawyers present with them, extremely tortured, and given really harsh sentences, mostly for charges that they have not committed. And it took a lot of time to provide enough stories and evidence that would force the traditional media to talk about military trials and therefore force or cause a change in the street and cause people to acknowledge more what's happening and support us rather than attack us. So I remember, like, the first press conference we had, there were all sorts of like independent newspapers and some channels. Basically no one wrote about we had live testimonies from people who were just released and who were tried in the kitchen of the prison, of the military prison, and we had one of the girls talking about the virginity check. We had lots of testimonies, and basically no one wrote about them. And I remember one newspaper in particular which was there, and the next morning, it's not just that they did not write about what we had, but they also featured a huge interview for the chief of military police, saying that all videos and all testimonies we have are forged, and that we are actually paid agents to cause a rift between the army and the people and sort of lead the country to ruins. We had the first popular conference. We decided that we are going to the neighborhoods from which people were arrested and military tried, and we are going to talk about military trials, the issue of military trials, and also give people a chance to tell their own stories. We were attacked by an army officer who just passed by and didn't like what he was hearing, so he got a couple of people from the neighborhood and they basically attacked us, and we ended up jumping from the window, but it was the ground floor. And at the end, we all ended up, us and the people and the army officer, in the police station. So it was, at the beginning, it was just this, and it was really hard on both fronts, not just the people in the street, but also to make people who have enough political weight adopt it. This is one thing. The other thing is also it was very hard to, it was very hard to reach, to find families, to get access to the families and to the detainees, because at the military court they would make it very difficult for our lawyers to access information, and nothing, we'd get nothing without public pressure and media pressure. And of course this means protest there, which would put, you know, families of detainees in danger. But after a while this shifted. Like by July, ending military trials for civilians was on top of everyone's agenda. It was one of the main demands of every protest in every square in Egypt. There was a big wave of sit-ins back in Tahrir and in other squares. The first demand was ending military trials for civilians. So it shifted a bit. I think also part of the difficulties are mostly not faced by us, but really by the families. At the core of the people working against military trials are really the mothers and the families of detainees. And we had families who turned into activists, especially mothers. One of my role models, Ahmed, who mobilizes and gets in contact with more families, and they would go every Saturday in front of the Ministry of Defense and stage a sit-in there and try to get more and more families to join them. And we had to find a way of having media coverage for them to give them protection, and many times they had to deal with the violence and aggression of the military police and the army guarding the Ministry of Defense there.
We're gonna have to move inside because
the light is fading.
I thought we might have a little longer, but we didn't. Great. All right. So, what is your strategy for advocacy, building public attention and support, and generating pressure on the Supreme Council of Armed Forces?
Okay. So at the beginning, it was really about, first of all, finding enough cases, like reaching out for enough families and having enough info on different cases, and also about providing stories that counter and show the lies in Supreme Council of Armed Forces stories. Our main approach was that it was very easy for people to dismiss a news item that says 20 were tried military trials for thuggery and were sent to prison for 10 years. But it was harder to dismiss the stories if you give them a face, a name, and a whole life behind it. So this is what we were really working on, telling the stories of those in prison and showing and focusing really on stories that show how unfair they were. Amr al-Bahiri was a very obvious story because I was an eyewitness with others, so we could actually show why we have no faith in this military trial process and military judiciary. And then we had other stories. We had, like, one of the major stories we worked on is for a young man who's 19 years old. His name is Mohammed Ishaq, and he was sentenced life sentence, supposedly for possession of Molotov cocktails and terrorizing people in the street. After 1 year of campaigning for him, he was found innocent. These kind of stories show how unfair the trials are, but also show how they are really just a tool. It's not, there are no legal process in it. It's not about law, it's not about order, it's not about justice. It's really about punishing the people who dare to revolt against this regime. And so you bring out these stories and this is what you use. It's really people's stories versus the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. And also evidence for the torture, because they keep on disputing torture testimonies. So we show footage of injuries caused by this torture. We tell the different stories you tell the stories so that people would understand that it's not just that they are not protected, that they could be the next victims. So at one point, military trials targeted students, workers on strike, protesters, women, men, and even children. So you tell these stories, and eventually people had to respond.
What is the significance of international recognition for you and for the No to Military Trials group, including the nomination for the Frontline Defenders Award for your work in Egypt?
Okay. In many of the cases, what helped was actually, in many, especially that involved protesters, not civilians, not regular civilians, it really the public pressure really helped, the international public pressure. So, for example, when we first talked about the virginity checks that the girls had to go through in March 9th, nobody of the local media wanted to cover this story. What forced the local media and other people to tackle it is that international media picked on it, and Amnesty International and other organizations focused on it. And this is what eventually brought it to the center of attention of people's work, and this is what constantly made them forced to give an excuse for it and justify it, and therefore show more and more the lies that were behind, because they completely denied it at the beginning, and then at different instances a member of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces admitted it but justified it. With also, I remember one of the first cases we worked on, which was the protesters of March 9th. They released all those high-profile protesters who were tried, but there were 120 people who are mainly unknown protesters or just wrongly accused civilians who were passing by, and they were all sentences between a year and 3 years. And they were spending them in prison. 2 months of campaigning on the local level, but also with the support of Amnesty and EU, eventually changed those sentences from valid sentences to suspended sentences, so they were released. I think Supreme Council of Armed Forces do care about the relationships with the Western countries, and especially with the US. And they care about their image. So they constantly do the crime, but they also try to frame it in a way that makes it as if they didn't commit the crime, and they were there to restore order in the country. And I think helping exposing them on the local level to widen the base of the popular support, but also on the international level to sort of embarrass them internationally with other countries, help them, not help them to stop the violations, but help them decrease. It's part of the things that pressure them to decrease the violations they commit.
Mm-hmm. What has been your best day as a human rights defender?
Okay. Well, on a very personal level, because I take these things personally, and because the whole journey of military trials really started by a very personal incident, which is Amr al-Bahiri, and I felt very responsible for him. So I think really the best day for me was the day he called me and he was released. It was almost 1 year after he was sent to prison, and I realized at one point that they might be making it more difficult for him to reappeal his sentence to punish us for creating such a big movement from one simple case. And then he was released, and he thought, when his family told him there's this big campaign that is really based on his story, he thought they were just telling him this to comfort him. But when he came out and he realized the scale of the campaign that was really made for him, and then sort of grew into this bigger thing that helped others. And when he called me, it was a very special moment.
Great. And your parents are well-known activists as well, and also your brother. How is it different for your generation? And what tools are you using that are different to your parents' generation, and does that make a difference for how you work?
Okay. First of all, for my parents, part of because I am from this family of long history of political activism, I think this gives me extra protection. And I think this is why me and others like me have more responsibility towards the less privileged. Because I know that when the army or the Supreme Council of Armed Forces decides to target me, this will bring media attention more than any other regular civilian. And therefore, this gives me extra protection to you know, work more on exposing them and support the others. We use, our generation, or me and my colleagues, we use actually their tools. A lot of the things that we are doing in military trials, the campaign for no military trials is not just young activists. It's like we are cooperating with young activists and with human rights organizations who have been working against this regime for years and years and years during Mubarak's era and now. So it's actually, we are depending on their expertise in documenting and in providing enough evidence to show violations and to document the story, in filing reports, in pursuing and forcing the institutions, the governmental institutions to actually act, to do their role, you know. So putting enough pressure on the general prosecutor to actually take a report, and putting enough pressure on the judiciary to not respond to the orders of the Supreme Council of Forces, and maybe consider the public good and so on. So it's their tools, but also our tools. I don't think we could have done this without what we call now alternative media, without having our own tools and our own ways of shooting the videos, putting them on YouTube, distributing them among us, setting up what we call Tahrir Cinema, which is a big screen in Tahrir Square, and screening those testimonies that back in June and July channels and TV stations wouldn't want to show them. Writing about them so that eventually we would force actually newspapers to write about them. So it's really their tools, their expertise with our new tools all mixed together. We also, at the beginning, I was personally using Twitter to cover what was happening and send it out to the outside world, because at that point this was our major thing, is that they were trying to disconnect us from the outside world, and we want them to know. But the moment we started working on military trials, I immediately switched. I was actually, back then I was tweeting in English, now my tweets are mainly in Arabic, because it was no longer, the main target was no longer the outside audience. The main target was actually locally, working locally on talking about the cause and gaining more supporters for it, but also mobilizing. So now we are working, our group is working here in Cairo, in Suez, and sometimes we cover other governors. And really all communication and information we get on people who were arrested by the military is through Twitter and phone, and it helps because they constantly try to hide the facts and hide the stories. So if we don't have these instant, methods of communication and massively distributing the information, we'd have people getting tried in Suez like we are having now, and we in Cairo wouldn't know about it. So we in Cairo won't have, won't be able to create media campaign for them that supports them. We thought that the pressure we created did not completely end military trials for civilians, but it did two things. It pressured for them to retry a lot of those who had been in prison since January, February and March, and it forced them to refer a lot of the recent massive arrests and protests were actually tried before their natural judges, civilian judges, and rather than military judges. But then this week, not last month, because we had the media focusing mainly on presidential elections, and we had a lot of unrest happening in Port Said and Suez. We had more than one big case of military trials, mainly for workers and for protesters, but intense. We are talking about like 15 being tried here and another 8 or 10 being tried here. But they went unnoticed. And we couldn't. We tried, and they were released, some of them were released eventually, but they went unnoticed in the media and in the public. And at the same time, in the parliament, they have been discussing changes in judiciary, in military law, in the law articles that allow military court to try civilians. But they have been discussing really not all the articles that needs to be changed, but putting them to the media as if they will put an end to military trials. So basically, Supreme Council of Armed Forces, with the aid of the parliament, have been intentionally misleading the public into thinking that there will no longer be any military trials. And then last week, or a couple of days back, May 5th, there was a major crackdown on protests in Abbasiyya Square, which is, they were all protests heading towards Ministry of Defense, since it is the symbol of those currently ruling the country and oppressing us. And this is the biggest wave of military trials for protesters that we've ever seen or dealt with since the beginning of the revolution. They have arrested more than 400 protesters. We still don't know the accurate number because they won't tell us. They won't reveal the information. They try to, most of them, they try to interrogate them in absence of the lawyers and really late at night. So it's really difficult accessing the information, finding out. Some of them were kept in hospital. Some of them were badly wounded and they were kept in hospital, and they hid the information about them, so we didn't find about them except a couple of days later. Some of them were actually detained with the military intelligence, and only now they started sending them to the military prosecution. So we don't know. We are talking about something between 400 and 700 civilians who have been arrested in one day only, and they are all facing military trials. And it's really, like, this group is really sort of representative of society. We have old women, young girls, we have children, we have 6 minors under 18, and we have all sorts of professions, all sorts of economic backgrounds. So it really feels as if we are back to square one, but on a bigger scale. The only difference is that we know we have more people on our side. At least people from the activists who are willing to work in the street. Of course, the way it was framed in the media is that they all were possessing arms and trying to break into the Ministry of Defense, which is completely not true. And even in the investigations, they did not provide weapons to give evidence for that, but then we know military trials are not about real trials. They're really about a game of media power, basically, and media pressure. So we are trying to, we are expanding the work of the group. More lawyers and more volunteers are joining in. We are battling again to get access to the information and to force them to accept our lawyers to attend with all those being tried. And it's exposing all the issues we have faced from the beginning. We are talking about military trials started in 28th of January 2011, and in September, the head of the military judiciary announced that almost 12,000 civilians have been tried. This is a far bigger number than those who have been tried during Mubarak's era. So we are talking about really a major issue. And they don't discriminate. They try children. I've worked on cases, the one in Abbasiyya, they actually tried a young girl who's 14 years old, but then they released her, and we have 6 under 18. Children are being tried constantly. We have 2 minors who are from other cases who are in prison right now. One of them spending a 7-year sentence, the other spending 15 years sentence. they all face torture. Torture is like, and when I mean torture, beating up and using electricity, like electric probes, and then there are other sexual harassment and molestation. So at least we have enough credit with the media and the people to talk about it now, but it's a major, like right now it's a major thing. And I think, and there's something very public about what they are doing. The next day after they arrested people, we went for a protest in front of the military court with the families of the detainees, which was beaten up 3 times, dispersed and 3 times, and 10 of the protesters who went there just to show solidarity were also detained and are now facing military trials as well. So this is a big, this is them basically saying this is open war between us and them, and they are using military trials for civilians, and they massively, and they don't care. And I think this is sort of the breaking point. If we manage to create enough resistance, local resistance, and expose them, in this case, in the Abbasiyya, with the Abbasiyya detainees, and create enough pressure from outside, I think this actually might help to put an end completely to military trials from now on, and maybe help the release of all those who have been spending months in jail because of military trials. If we don't, then we are actually giving up in one of the most important battles, and we are actually giving them the green light to use military trials in any other incident in the coming future against revolutionaries.
So you think that there's the possibility that after the presidential elections, if they can set a standard now of this being acceptable, after the presidential elections they'll still be able to use
yes, or if what is happening now is actually sort of a plot to postpone presidential elections, then you're also talking about extra months of massive use of military trials and of massively sending people to prisons, and ultimately making it more and more difficult for, eventually when you have someone in power who wants to actually solve this issue, he would be dealing with, you know, another 6,000 cases rather than the cases that we have so far. So I really think this battle sort of is our last battle with them. They came on full force with everything. They went down on protesters with army, with live bullets, with plainclothes civilians, and with the aid of the police. So this is them full force, and with, you know, military trials, their main tool for oppression and for silencing the protesters. And if we, the young revolutionaries, with the aid of the older generation and all human rights organizations on the front line, did not come up with a solid campaign that puts an end to this, we would be actually setting military trials as a default for them to use in every other instance. So, yeah.
I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, it's definitely I mean, I was